Good evening. On May 9, 2012, President Jacob Zuma will mark his third year in power in his maiden term. It's a time marked by global, Pan-African, as well as national challenges. Now, the global economy suffered its biggest recession since the Second World War. Now, that helped snap South Africa's longest period of economic expansion in decades, resulting in the economy losing almost 1 million jobs. Tonight, the President joins us for the first time here on CNBC Africa to review that term and look ahead as Africa arguably enters its most exciting phase of opportunity in history. This is Africa Rising. We are face to face with President Jacob Zuma. Mr. President, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you very much to be here.
I wanted to begin by reading you something that I'm hoping you will remember. Let me go. We make a commitment here and now, before the eyes of the world, that for as long as there are South Africans who die from preventable disease, for as long as there are workers who struggle to feed their families, for as long as there are communities without clean water, decent shelter, or proper sanitation, for as long as there are rural dwellers unable to make a decent living from the land on which they live, for as long as there are women who are subjected to discrimination, exploitation, or abuse, for as long as there are children who do not have the means or the opportunity to receive a decent education, for as long as there are people who are unable to find work, we shall not rest and we dare not falter. Do you remember those words, Mr. President?
Yes, I do.
The words that you uttered at your inauguration.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for coming through and talking to us tonight. When you look back, it will be 3 years on May 9, as I said. How much of that promise has been fulfilled from your perspective?
I think some of it has been, and of course, as you would know, dealing with South Africa is not an easy challenge, given its history. But again, we came across, unfortunately, shortly thereafter, the economic meltdown,
Sure.
which had a lot of impact globally, as well as in our own country. So whatever we might have had as very clear plans, they got, in a sense, interrupted. But I think, despite all of that,
Sure.
we have tried to make some movement forward on the vows that we took on that day, and we still continue to do so.
Sure.
I think we have made some progress.
There has been some progress. Let's begin perhaps by looking at the globe and where perhaps the biggest part of the problems that you have faced in your maiden term have come from. When you came in, you engaged with the G20. You got South Africa to be a part of BRICS. And all, I would imagine, it was part of the effort to try to make sure that Africa's voice and South Africa's voice was heard at the global level. When you look at it now, how much can we say that Africa genuinely influences part of the discourse that we hear around the globe, around global economic issues that are derailing the economic growth path?
Well, I think we've tried our best. As you correctly say, when we came in, the world was facing this challenge.
Yes.
You remember that it was also at a time when a number of leaders from the developing countries, they went to the then G8. The G20 was not there.
Yes.
Wherein they would spend more time in the periphery and come at a given time towards the end of the summits to make their inputs or whatever. Since then, G20 has come about, and South Africa is part of it.
Yes.
I think that is an inroad we have made in the global setting in very important leaders that discuss issues of this world, and I think the African voice has been heard at that level. So I think it has been a success. And thereafter, as you know, South Africa also joined the BRIC to make it BRICS.
Yes.
You will also appreciate that Africa, at that before South Africa becoming part of BRICS, was almost like nowhere in these important groupings, which are basically economic groupings of the world. And therefore, these 1 billion people of this continent of Africa, they are not represented in a serious kind of a grouping. we have succeeded to be part of BRICS and therefore represented the continent of Africa in a very important grouping. BRICS is an important grouping from a number of points, but one of the critical points is that you have the globe today that is changing. Its economic landscape is changing. The developing world is coming very powerfully to be one of the factors that determine the direction of the economies and the speed with which the economy develops.
Sure.
And therefore, for South Africa to be part of that grouping, it meant that Africa is now part of determining, or to be part of the countries that will determine the direction to some degree, and therefore the voice of the continent has been put in a very important level, very important platform. I think from that point of view, Africa, where South Africa has participated,
yes,
has made very big strides in terms of participating in the activities, particularly economic activities of this continent.
Sure. So at the political level, we've made some inroads. But what about at the institutional level? At those important institutions, such as the World Bank, such as the International Monetary Fund, the conversation there has been there needs to be reform. But that seems to have stalled, Mr. President.
Yes, there has been a lot of debate on that. I think that has been one of the issues that almost all the summits of the G20 have been discussing that issue.
Yes.
As well as BRICS, as well as the as well as other institutions. That has been the critical issue. The United Nations, we've been discussing it in our own continent, in AU. That time has come. I think to some degree we could say that debate has made an impact, because I think there has been a recognition, yes, that the developing countries have not participated. And I think there's been some recognition and some legal opening. I don't think the debate now is you cannot be here. It's a question of how do you come in.
Yes.
I think that's where it has stalled a little bit, because the concrete action to make us to be part of it has not been quite quick. And is a debate that we are pushing forward. And I think even now, because there are some openings that are emerging, we've been consulting already to say, we are there, we need to be part of it. Certainly, it is our view that you cannot have the developing world, which is now making such an impact in the economic activities, not being part of the decision-making, the final decision-making in terms of the financial institutions. Is absolutely important, and it's a question of how do we make it happen. And of course, those who have been there for a long time, I don't think much as they accept the reality, but I don't think they feel they just walk away quickly. And I think there's a question of how do you do it without upsetting the furniture in the room, so to speak.
Mr. President, without upsetting you, I would like to see one day when perhaps there's a South African who's heading the World Bank. I've heard whispers, maybe the planning minister, Mr. Trevor Manuel, may well end up there. But I'm certainly hoping and looking forward to that day. We're joined now from our Nairobi studios by Patrick Obath. He's chairman of East Africa Business Council, and he's also the chairman of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Good evening, Mr. Obath, and welcome to CNBC Africa. Thank you for joining us. Would you like to put your question to the President, please?
Yes, Mr. President, my question is around the efforts that leaders in Africa are giving to two sectors. One is regional economic zones and trying to form regional economic zones and grow them. And then also the fact that you're trying to grow an African Union. Whilst we're doing this, we also need the economies of those countries to grow rapidly so that we are part of the world economy. In your view, which is more important, getting the leaders to work at the regional level or getting the leaders to work at the Africa level?
Mr. President.
They are both important. There's not one which is not important than the other. You will, of course, appreciate that what African leaders have said many decades, we needed to be united in the continent.
Yes.
And therefore, the question of the African unity becomes crucial. It is that decision that was taken by the founders of the OAU, now the AU, that created a platform that we could talk about the challenges of the continent from a collective, well-organized body.
True.
And therefore, that has been very much important politically to say, what are the issues? And therefore, to look at the challenges in terms of political and challenges in terms of economic challenges of the continent. And you'd also appreciate that when the OAU was established, it was during the time of the Cold War, when the world was divided into two, and therefore that in itself delayed the movement forward of the continent, because each bloc was trying to win over African leaders and Africans in particular. But once that happens, on the other hand, we have said, how do we address the economic situations of our continent?
Sure.
Particularly because we come from different, much as they all come from Europe, but different countries that colonized Africa.
Yes.
So you have Africa that was divided into a number of countries. We then had to say, for Africa to address the economic issues, you can't say as a huge, a big continent, we should just let it go, all go.
Would like to be like China.
I'm sure we'd reach that point. I'm sure China has its own history,
True.
where it comes from. We thought it was important to divide Africa on 5 economic regions so that the task is manageable by each region in terms of the economic interests and development and how we look at the development of Africa.
Sure.
We have succeeded to do so. I think they are now well established. What, therefore, we are doing is how do we make these? Because the idea was, how will you begin from there in order to unite Africa at economic activities?
Right.
I think we've succeeded to do so. You will recall that not long time ago, last year, we established a free trade zone of 3 very big regional, economic regional organizations in the continent, SADC, including the 2 other regions, wherein half of the population of the continent is now working together.
Right.
That tells you we're moving forward. We are moving step by step. In fact, the last summit, which was there in January, began to discuss the amalgamation of all 5.
Yeah.
That is the plan that we are taking. I think as a continent, therefore, that is realizing that we are the fast growing, that we have got 1 billion people. We now see the logic of us coming together as this one block composed of these 5, so that we can compete at an equal level with other regions.
But the question, Mr. President, is, are those regional blocks working? I attended Davos, and one of the issues that came up, and it was very well enunciated by the President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Donald Kaberuka, when he spoke about the regions that we currently have, then the difficulties of getting them to integrate. His comment was that what you're finding is, yes, there are these structures that have been put in place, but politically we are not moving and implementing the very decisions that are required to give practical effect to the political decisions that have been taken to create these blocks and get them function. How do we get them to work so that the business people, including the people who are here, actually see practical change on the ground?
I don't think it's going to be that easy, as if we look back at the history of the continent. As I said, it was colonized by different kind of countries who themselves were not together.
True.
They only came together after they left colonizing us. They then came together.
At the Berlin Conference.
At yes. Now, the fact that we have discussed these matters from the OAU to AU more emphatically, we have taken very concrete decisions. I think the fact that the 3 regions came together is a very concrete and practical step that we undertook to declare the trade-free zone, which was not there before. And now if people say they don't see that as a step forward, now they would be wanting us to start running before we crawl. I think we are moving step by step. I'm saying the AU as an organization has taken a decision that we must now all come together.
Sure.
That is critical. I know that people are at times very critical, at times overcritical of what Africa is doing, because the AU itself has recognized that we cannot live in this continent without intra-trade in the continent. And therefore, we have moved to say, what is it that will make us implement that?
Sure.
We have identified the infrastructure as a critical thing at all levels. And that is what the AU has taken a decision. That is what we are working on now to create the infrastructure, because without that infrastructure, we could not bring about any concrete thing.
Sure.
So I don't know why the view would be Africa is not doing it, because we are doing it.
I think
both at political and economic level.
I think business people are impatient people. Where there's an opportunity, they want to grab the opportunity right at the moment. But I referred earlier to Davos, and one of the overwhelming impressions I remember that came out of Davos was that hardly anywhere did you go where people were not speaking positively about Africa. And the key question then becomes, how do we harness this goodwill for Africa now at this juncture to make sure that we take advantage of Europe's problems and put in place policies that help to get business here and help grow our economies?
I'm happy you make the point that wherever we went in Davos...
But is that what you found yourself?
Yes, people spoke positively, unless the Africans themselves started speaking negatively about themselves. That was my observation.
I met a lot of Africans. They were very happy, but I must have met those ones.
You remember at one point where heads of state were together. I think the response by the people and what they said was highly appreciated. As I say, until I met Africans who were speaking, who felt that Africa is in trouble. I don't think Africa is in trouble. I think we are making some progress. What we are trying to do, I think Africa historically has been left on its own when things were happening all over the globe. But now, among other things, whilst Africa is continuing with its historical ties with the developed world,
right,
but Africa is also part of the South. And we are participating in the developments and interaction in the South, which I think is making Africa change. Africa is no longer like the Africa of yesterday. We are therefore taking advantage of that, particularly because of the ailing economies in other areas. We are, for an example, today aware that the developed economies are no longer developing in a bigger kind of margin.
Sure.
But the developing South is, we are part of it, and without abandoning the old relations, but we are really deepening the new relations which are giving us benefit. So I think we're doing everything to be part of everything. We, as I talked about BRICS, for an example, there's a lot of interaction if you talk about Brazil, China, India, and there are even very structured relationship between China and Africa, India and Africa. So I'm saying there are a lot of activities that we're undertaking that are showing that Africa has a direction to go.
Yeah, I think an important part of the conversation as we go forward has to be to convince these Africans that are skeptical about the continent, because these are the very same people that need now to be investing in Africa, and we need them to believe in the promise of an African dawn. One practical suggestion that I had was that we need to arrive at a situation where we have a Schengen-type visa. You know, you want to go to Germany, or you want to go to Belgium, or you want to go to France. If you go to the embassy of France and you get your visa, it allows you to enter these countries. When are we going to see practical effect where I, a citizen of Southern Africa, is able to move freely within the region and do business where I wish?
Well, we must take into account that it took Europe decades and decades to reach that point.
I'm looking for a time frame, Mr. President.
And it took them 2 world wars fighting among themselves.
We can't do that.
That's the point. That's the point I'm making. That's the point I'm making. They've succeeded to come to the EU. I think Africa should be given a chance. I'm very optimistic. My view is that Africa is actually moving. The fact that we have changed the OAU into the AU was in fact informed by that wish. The fact that we have realized that we have got to have a better connectivity in the continent. We have got to establish our own infrastructure. We have got to beneficiate what is our worth. That, I think, is a movement towards that situation. Bear in mind that the influences from outside are also another challenge.
Sure.
Because those that have been in Africa for a long time don't want to let it go in many ways. So there are a number of challenges, but without that, because we are not fighting anyone, we are saying, let us work with everybody to ensure that as the continent we come together. Once that happens, it's going to be very easy to have that common visa that you could put in. Because at the moment, there may be even issues that if you walked very fast, you are likely to have abuses by other forces outside of the continent. They could abuse that. Those that have very close links with others, they might actually use those countries for other reasons. So at the moment, I think the pace is just right. It's a question of how do we deepen it? How do we deal with concrete things? For an example, even before we reach that point, we need to open our borders. And this has been the subject of discussion, that it should not be difficult to move from one country to other, as it is, and it has been. Once we do all of that, once we've got the infrastructure, it's going to be easy to have that visa so that you could move in Africa. I don't think it's going to take long. I don't think I could specify the time frame.
I was hoping.
No, I wouldn't. Because that is going to depend how well we organize, how well we gel as the countries, how well we feel we are all benefiting. I think the establishment of the infrastructure and the intertrade, that is what is going to lead to us taking some of these decisions without looking back.
Well, Mr. President, I certainly hope that will be soon, and I'm hoping it will be in my lifetime.
It will be certainly in your lifetime.
I certainly hope so. Now, one of the challenges that Africa faces is unemployment, and we're going to talk about the jobs issue a little later on in the program. But there's a particular issue that is prevalent across the whole continent, and it's the issue of jobs for youth. Now, we'll be joined from Lagos by the CEO of First Bank, and he's got an issue around jobs creation by the youth. Mr. Onasanya, CEO of First Bank, thank you very much indeed for joining us live here at CNBC Africa. But I wanted to tell the President, before I come to you, that here at CNBC Africa, actually, we are doing our bit to integrate Africa, because we cross live every single day to the different geographies in Africa. We link Nairobi, we link Lagos, we link Abuja, we link Cape Town, we link Zambia, we linking Namibia. So we are doing our bit. But let's come to the issue of youth unemployment across Africa. What's your take from Nigeria, where you sit and where we know you've got a very large population? 150 million people is a lot of people.
Thank you, and Mr. President, it's nice to be with you.
Thank you.
I note the fact that when we were in Davos, the entire world received Africa and continues to see Africa as the destination to be for investments. But do you think, with unemployment at about 24% both for South Africa and Nigeria, that we are actually prepared to address the issue of manpower supply when the foreign investors take advantage of the opportunities that exist in Africa today? Are we preparing our people to be able to take advantage and benefit from this issue of foreign direct investments into Africa? That's my question.
Yes, I think we are. I think we are trying to do so. I don't think it is an easy one, partly because of the history again. If I take South Africa that I know best, you will appreciate that the system that we had before tackled the majority of this country at the most sensitive issue, education. It was really regulated, laws passed to ensure that the majority of the people in South Africa who happen to be black were not given the proper education. That is the legacy that we have to challenge today. We have therefore prioritized education as apex of our 5 priorities. And we cannot solve the problem of employment if we have not tackled seriously the question of education. And I think we are tackling it. We have, in addition to that, created an environment wherein we would want to work together with the private sector, wherein the question of the type of jobs that we create are jobs that could employ people. We are, for an example, talking about the infrastructure in the continent that opens up. Some countries, for an example, if you take South Africa, precisely because of the kind of economic possibilities it has attracted a number of citizens from the continent.
Sure.
And they then flock into one country. Now, we are saying we need to open up the economy so that in each and every country opportunities are there. We have, for an example, in this country, made it a point that we give ourselves specific percentage of the jobs that we want to create within a particular period so that we work against a particular plan.
Sure.
Although, as I said earlier, the economic meltdown globally has, in a sense, interrupted that kind of process. But this is an attempt that we're trying to do. We believe that whatever is done by the investors that come, we are saying today it must not be like before, wherein they came, they mined, they took the raw material
Sure.
and left with it. We are saying that process must now be accompanied by the establishment of the beneficiation kind of industries so that our people become part of the process. We think because we are creating that process, we are not going to have our people, once they are empowered with education, they then go across the seas to go and look for employment.
Sure.
We must create the employment here. What, therefore, we've been talking about, the regional integration, the opening of the infrastructure, opens up those possibilities that the Africans must be on their own, working their own continent. I don't think it's a matter that you could overcome overnight.
It will take time.
It will take time, but I think we have plans to
Mr.
deal
President,
with it.
we have to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to be delving into issues surrounding South African economy, including jobs creation, the goals of the National Planning Commission, and in the studio with us, we're also going to be putting forward questions to the President, and they include our Investigative Chief Executive Stephen Kosef and also Michael Jordan from FNB. Don't go away.